So hello everyone, it's a beautiful spring day and we're getting into March. And with March, we usually think of St. Patrick's Day. And St. Patrick's Day is actually one of my favorite holidays. And that might surprise you because as far as I know, I don't have any Irish ancestry. But I'm not interested in St. Patrick's Day so much because of the Celtic culture and because of the Irish culture. But I'm interested in St. Patrick as a historical figure and also the times that St. Patrick lived in. And by the way, St. Patrick, he was a missionary to Ireland, but he himself actually wasn't Irish, and I'll share a little bit more in just a second. But first I want to talk a little bit about the times of St. Patrick. So St. Patrick lived in the 400s, so about 1600 years ago. And it was in that century that the Roman Empire collapsed. And you could say that it was the worst of times and it was the best of times. So I want to start a little bit with what was good in St. Patrick's time. So if you were a Christian living in the 400s, you could be very thankful that the periods of persecution that had existed before had finally come to an end. So what I mean by that is for the first 300 years of Christian history, it was illegal to be a Christian for the most part. Many Christians paid with their lives for their faith in Jesus. And in the 300s, the Emperor Constantine made it legal to be a Christian or to hold any other religious view. And also in St. Patrick's Day, a very brutal, decadent culture was coming to an end. In the Roman Empire, people would crowd coliseums to watch blood sport. And that was ending, and there were starting to be more protections, more humanity, more laws favoring the protection of the weak and the sick and the infirmed. So a lot of good was happening, but a lot of bad was happening too. The economy was falling apart. Cities were being abandoned as the empire was crumbling. There were attacks from without. Tribes that used to be at the very periphery of the then known world were now coming in and invading the Roman Empire. Yes, Christianity was legal, but so were heretical movements, what we would call today as cults. They were spreading, and the most famous of that time was Arianism. Arianism claimed that Jesus was a good man, but that he wasn't who he claimed to be, that he wasn't the Son of God. Very soon Islam would come on the scene and be a major threat to Christianity. The church was changing. The church had previously been independent, small congregations, and now you had the office of the Pope. In the office of the Pope, that was making it possible for the church to be a lot more organized as a structure administratively, but it also created risks and challenges because you're putting Christianity under a fallible human being. But in this period of change, you had two famous men who lived at this time. So the first was St. Augustine, and St. Augustine was from North Africa. I sometimes wonder if some of my ancestors on my mother's side may have known St. Augustine, perhaps. I've traced her lineage a couple centuries, and it seems to quite possibly go back to North Africa. Patrick, on the other hand, was an ordinary Christian from Britain. So contrasting these two men's lives, so Augustine spent his life trying to understand God's purposes in history. And that interested Augustine because of all the change that was happening at this time. Augustine came to understand Bible prophecy as amillennial. So what that means is it's a lot more simplified understanding than some of the other systems that existed before or after. Augustine's most famous book is City of God. And City of God is a Christian understanding of history that has shaped a lot of Western culture over the centuries. And if you look at Martin Luther or John Wesley or the theologians of today, most of them are at least somewhat influenced by Augustine. Interestingly, a lot of the questions that Augustine was trying to answer about what God's purposes were, they were being answered by a man named Patrick. Patrick didn't write very much. Patrick only wrote his personal testimony and a few other very short writings that were addressing issues of his time. But what Patrick did is he brought the gospel to the barbarians. So who are the barbarians? So if you look at the epistle to the Romans or you look at the epistle to the Colossians, you'll sometimes see the word barbarians. And barbarians were people who lived outside of the Greco-Roman world. So these were people who were a lot less cultured. These were people who were very steeped in the occult. You look at Halloween. Halloween came from the barbarians, the Celtic peoples of Northern Europe. In Patrick's time, many people thought that Jesus was about to return, because they looked at Matthew 24:14, and it talks about how the gospel had to reach the whole world. Now, we today understand that it hadn't reached the whole world, but many of them, they were looking at the world as being the Greco-Roman world, the world system. They didn't understand that God had a plan for those far-flung parts of the world where you had these lesser-known people groups. And it would be Patrick who would bring the gospel to a lot of these pagan cultures. So Patrick, he was brought up in a Christian home, in a British Christian home. No, Patrick wasn't Irish. Patrick was from England. And Patrick rebelled as a youth from his Christian faith, as often is the case. And Patrick was sold into slavery in Ireland. And how that came about is at this time in history, you had bands of barbarians who would come into previously safe parts of the Roman Empire, and they would loot villages, they would pillage and plunder, and they would take people as slaves. And that's what happened to Patrick. So Patrick ended up in Ireland, and he served a master named Milchu. And I know the name Milchu, I often think it sounds like a Pokemon name. It sounds like Pikachu, but it was Milchu. And it was while he was in Ireland as a slave that Patrick came to faith in Jesus. And the Lord allowed Patrick, almost miraculously, to regain his freedom. So Patrick returned back into the UK, back into England, and he reconnected with family and friends in the community he grew up in. And Patrick said this about his experience in slavery. God watched over me before I knew him, and before I learned sense or even distinguish between good and evil. And he protected me and consoled me as a father would his son. Those are the words of St. Patrick, and it reminds us of how God has his hand on our lives, sometimes even before we come to faith in Jesus or before we understand right from wrong. But interestingly, the Lord didn't have Patrick just return to a life of relative ease back in his childhood hometown. The Lord called Patrick back to Ireland to bring the gospel message to the people who had once enslaved him. And Patrick would spend decades of his life, he'd spend the rest of his life in Ireland, reaching tribal chiefs and kings and common people with the message of the gospel. He would explain the doctrine of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, with a shamrock. So the shamrock, it has 3 leaves, and he used that to explain to the people about how God is 3 in 1. He brought the celebration of Easter, the resurrection of Jesus, to the Irish people. By the time Patrick died, Ireland was fast becoming not a pagan culture, but a Christian culture. It's been said that if any one man could be thought of as bringing the gospel to a whole nation and converting a nation in Christian history, it would be Patrick. And interestingly, the Irish people, as the Roman Empire collapsed, the Irish people would preserve the scriptures and would preserve a lot of the early Christian writings during the tumultuous periods of the Middle Ages. And we celebrate St. Patrick's Day on March 17 because that's the day that the Lord called Patrick home. It's interesting that we don't celebrate St. Augustine's Day. There is such a day that Catholics and some liturgical Christians celebrate, but we celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And St. Patrick was a much more ordinary man, and it goes to show that God can use ordinary people. So this St. Patrick's Day, I think it's a good time to maybe share a little bit of the story of St. Patrick, whether you have Irish roots or not. It's a good story to share with family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, because they're often very interested in why do we celebrate some of the holidays that we celebrate. And St. Patrick's Day, it has such a strong Christian story to it. So I hope you have a great St. Patrick's Day, and I hope you remember the meaning of the day and look into the story a little bit more. There's dramas that have been done on TV and in motion pictures about St. Patrick, and there's also documentaries, and it's a great story. It's a great story to learn more about. So have a great St. Patrick's Day and happy springtime.
I bind unto myself today the gift to call on the Trinity, the saving faith where I can say, come 3 in 1, oh 1 in 3, be above me as high as the noonday sun, be below me the rock I set my feet upon. Be beside me, the wind on my left and right. Be behind me, circle me with your truth and light. La da 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 da, la da 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 da, la da 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 da, la da 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 da. I bind unto myself today the love of angels and seraphim, the prayers and prophecies of saints, the words and deeds of righteous men. Be above me as high as the noonday sun. Be below me the rock I set my feet upon. Be beside me, the wind on my left and right. Be behind me, circle me with your truth and light. La da 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 da, la da 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 da. God's ear to hear me, God's hand to guide me, God's might to uphold me, God's shield to hide me against all powers deceiving, against my own unbelieving, whether near or far. I bind unto myself today the hope to rise from the dust of earth, the songs of nature giving praise to Father Spirit, living word. Be above me as high as the noonday sun. Be below me the rock I set my feet upon. Be beside me, the wind on my left and right. Be behind me, circle me with your truth and light. La da 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 da, la da 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 da. I bind unto myself today the gift to call on the Trinity.